One problem you can run into when creating textures from photographs is having to remove large areas of black or shadows from the photograph. This is usually caused by taking photographs within high sun, and typically you'd want to take the photograph within an overcast sky, but that's not always possible. In this case, I have a texture I've created where I've already removed the seams and made this a seamless texture. And the source photograph was of some older and rather eroded brick. Now, the bricks that are jutting out are causing a shadow underneath them. There's a really fairly quick and easy way we can remove all the black without having to spend a lot of time editing and still having a matching texture. And this is a technique you'll want to use after the seams have been fixed, because with seams still in the photograph or the texture you're working on, this is going to just create more seams. So once all the seams are removed and it's a seamless texture, what you can easily do is we're just going to take the layer and drag it down here to the bottom over the create new layer, which is going to create a copy. And I want to set our blending mode to lighten. Now, we're not going to see any changes because we haven't manipulated the texture. And what the lighten mode is going to do is take the layer and the lighter parts of the area compared to the layer beneath it and lighten those up. So in this case, what we want to do is take the black or the shadows and lighten them with the texture. So now that we have the lighten mode set, what we can do is go up to filter, and under other we have the offset, which is what we use to basically remove the seams from our textures. But in this case we're offsetting the exact same texture. And you can also do this with other image overlays as well to remove the black. So depending on the offset you use, and the goal is to try to get the least amount of shadow overlapping between the two textures. Although you could also modify the layer before blending it, but that kind of defeats the purpose of this since it's a quick and easy way to remove the shadows. So if I just turn off the preview and turn it back on, we can see what is happening to the texture. If you need to offset it a little and really kind of adjust that and play around with it until it looks good, then you can spend really as much time as you want, but you don't want to spend too much time tweaking with that because you're always going to end up, at least in this case, with some of the overlaps of the shadows, but it requires a lot less cleanup than the image we had before, where we have tons of shadows just showing up everywhere. And that's going to be a lot of clone stamping, and just by using this overlay, we can really easily remove all of that. Now you also want to make sure too that any of the elements that are showing up in the lighter areas are not repeating themselves very obviously. So you'll want to give a good amount of offset. If it's right next to the original image, just a slight offset, then you're going to see some cloning showing up, and that's not going to look very good. So I'm just going to stick with something a little bit lower, and just remove the majority of the shadows without any major overlaps. And click OK. And now if we take a look in the normal mode, we can see the offset Switch that back to lighten, and now all of our shadowed areas are being lightened by the light areas in the exact opposite parts of the same texture. And we really don't see any major repeating, so it looks like our offset should be good. And now we have very minimal work in order to remove some of these shadowed areas. Although what we can also do is repeat the process, although you wouldn't want to do it too many times because then you're going to end up with some strange pattern effects. But one nice thing about this too is if you did want some of the shadow to show up, you could reduce the opacity amount. And in this case, if we were to just lighten these shadows and try to make them a little brighter, because they are so dark in the photograph with the exposure, there's more than likely not really a lot of data within those areas. So we wouldn't really be able to pull anything out of the photograph, and in most cases, because of the low light, it's going to be really, really grainy if we did. So this way we could at least add in some detail to the darker areas if you still wanted to have some shadowed parts of your texture. Or if you wanted to be able to go back or use that for a diffusion or bump map. So you could have it at 100% for the color, and then for bumps or normals or anything you're going to be working with to shape the object and the texture, then you can start to reduce that and use that information where now you have a texture underneath, but you haven't lost all of the depth. So if we wanted to do any cleanup on this, we can just clone stamp the main layer or the new overlay rather than manipulating the original source layer. So either way it's going to work, and it's a much quicker way to remove all of those shadows. And now I'm just going to close this out, and we're going to take a look at another image. And here we just have a wall texture. But there are a lot of really dark areas that don't really have the necessary color or detail in order to be able to get a good tiling texture. And this one, like the other one, is also already seamless. So let's go ahead and just set up the exact same setup where we copy the layer, set this to the lighten mode, and then go to filter, other, and offset. Now, what we're going to notice with this texture is because we have so many light areas, those patterns are going to show up on top of this texture. And with a small amount of offset, you can really see that repeating pattern I was referring to before, where this really wouldn't work because all of those light areas are showing up, creating the pattern. So we would need to make sure we have a good deal of offset in order to use the technique with this material. I'm going to go ahead and click OK with the offset. And in this case, this might actually work, although we do have repeating of the light areas. So you could either turn down the opacity amount and just lighten up some of those zones, since a lot of the detail in this texture really is with the shadow, a lot of that depth. So you could reduce the opacity with it. Another thing is once you have the blend mode set up, I'm going to hit Control L to open levels, but what you can also do is go to Image and Adjustments and choose Levels. And by making modifications to the histogram and just the overall look, you can fine-tune a little bit better the different outputs from both the shadows and the highlighted areas to either get a good blend between the two, come up with something completely different. And you can see that the texture will change greatly, although it really is just kind of transitioning between either the offset or the base texture that we have underneath that we're removing the shadows from. So you could fine tune this to get it to show up a little bit better. And now we have more of the top offset layer showing the detail from the layer rather than the base layer, so we can see an offset of some of the details. But this ends up working a little bit better now. And we could go back and adjust the opacity amount if you wanted to blend those together. But let's take a look at something else we can do ahead of time. I'm just going to delete that layer and make another copy. And now before I go ahead and change this over and offset it, I want to remove the highlights. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. One quick and easy way is just to go to Image and Adjustments and use the Replace Color tool. What then you can do is select one of the highlighted areas, adjust the fuzziness amount so that you're just seeing the highlights, and what you can do is just decrease the lightness. And you might need to increase saturation whenever you're reducing the lightness, because of course the brighter areas aren't going to have as much color. And I do want a little bit of variation, so we'll just turn down that amount a little. You can adjust the fuzziness even more, how much you want to transition into the texture. Click OK. I'm going to change this to the lighten mode and go up to our offset. And now we can see that just the shadows are being removed. And since we removed all the highlights, those are not showing up within the texture, because all of the areas we're lightening with are not brighter than the highlights we already have in the underlying texture. So that ends up being a much better solution for this texture, where we can just directly remove all of the shadows without any highlights from the offset layer interfering. And then once again, if we want to adjust the opacity amount, we can easily do that as well to get back some of that detail if we want it. But typically for a color map, we wouldn't want that showing up. And in this case, we might also want to remove these highlights that are showing up, because a lot of the key points to creating a seamless texture is really to remove a lot of the defining elements, and some of these highlights might be problematic, and we might see them repeating. Now granted, that removes a lot of the characteristics of this texture, because if you look at it with the shadows and the highlights, you can really see the depth. But that's not something you would want to be part of the color map. So what we can do is just merge these two layers. If you hold down Shift and select both layers, you can just click on them to select them, and then if you using Windows, you can hit Control E to merge those together. You can also go up to Layer and either Merge Visible or Merge Layers, which is what I used, Control E. Now what we're going to do is a reverse process, where we're going to darken the highlights in the exact same manner. I'm going to go ahead and create a copy. And because I don't want any of these dark spots and patterns showing up, we're going to use the Replace Color on the dark areas this time. And we'll go ahead and lighten those up. And we may need to increase the saturation to get the color to blend. Go ahead and click OK. And now we can set this to darken. Go up to Filter, Other, and Offset. And now as we offset this texture, we can remove the majority of the highlights. So from these very defined sections to very minimal highlights. So now we have a texture that we'll be able to repeat and render with throughout a surface and not have to worry about the tiling effect, which is really seeing the patterns over and over again. And where we would have really seen that before, it's not going to be quite so obvious now. And it didn't take a lot of steps in order to get to this point. So this is a pretty quick and easy and very useful technique to remove the shadows and also highlights if needed.